All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. I hope you all had a good long weekend. Maybe got outside, enjoyed some of the weather. I think I said to spend some time outside if you can on Friday, and then sure enough, here we had cloudy, rainy weather through most of the weekend here today, but it was still a nice weekend. So welcome back, everybody. If you are watching this live, I see we've got a couple people trickling in here, or if you are watching this on the recording back later, welcome back and thank you for tuning in. This is a live style Q&A show to answer any questions you have about DFS, about SaberSim, about sports betting, really whatever you guys want to talk about. It is a Q&A live show for a reason. We are asking for clarifying questions. We want follow-up questions. I know I get a little excited sometimes and just start rambling and maybe talking a little bit too fast. And if there is something confusing, I want to hear about it. I want you guys to pop into Slack or into the YouTube chat here and say, hold on, what you just said was confusing. You lost me. Let's go back a little bit. Also, I'm on this show every day, but I realize that some of you guys may not be watching every day. So if I take something for granted that we talked about in a previous show or gloss over something that we talked about yesterday, but we need to review something there, let me know. I'm happy to do that as well. So this is also a daily show for a reason. We host this show every single day because we want to look at the slates that are going on that day, whatever we've got, and use them for examples. Again, I've said this a few times now. I'm going to keep mentioning this in case this is somebody's first time tuning into this show, but this is not a tout show, and this is not a pick show. We are not giving out plays, but we want to use the slates and the data that we have for every single day and use it as an example. So we can talk about baseball tonight and say, you know, some big slate strategy. We can talk about NBA and talk about some small slate strategy. So we want to be able to use the most recent up-to-date information to help have some of these conversations. So let's see. With that said, I mentioned NBA small slates, right? I also talked about that a little bit last week. We are using this section of time on Thursdays for office hours and calling them DFS strategy sessions or sports betting sessions, whatever. The point is they are going to be a longer form video, still recorded live, still with some live Q&A. We'll pull some other members of the SaberSim team into those, do a little bit more of a webinar style format where we kind of talk through some concepts about a particular DFS idea or something like that, and then break into some Q&A after that. So last week we had a great sports betting session. We talked about how to use SaberSim sports betting model, how to use the prop betting model. We had Max and Andy on, and they were talking a little bit about their individual sports betting strategies. We also talked a little bit about how to use the sports betting tools on SaberSim to help enhance your DFS play. If you missed that, it is now up on YouTube. I've got it time-stamped by topic. It's a great conversation. I highly recommend you check it out, whether you sports bet every day, whether you're looking at getting into it, or whether you're just a DFS player that wants to get a little bit better at your DFS practice. So this Thursday, the topic is going to be NBA and short slate. NBA short slate and showdown strategy. So we've been getting a lot of questions about that in the past couple of weeks with the playoffs going on. Really interesting conversations going on in here in office hours, but we want to bring a couple other members of the SaberSim team in there and talk a little bit more, do a deep dive into NBA short slate strategy. So tune into that as well. That's on Thursday. We're all pretty excited about that. Let's see. Not much else in terms of general kind of housekeeping or news here. These have been really successful so far. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback, so I'm glad folks are enjoying it. Continue to let me know if there's anything we can do to make office hours a little bit better here. I'm continuing to work on my end to make these I know these are probably just riveting to listen to so far, but we want to up our production value a little bit here on the stream and make these a little bit more exciting to watch too. So some interesting things coming here down the pipe in that regard. But for now, I will go ahead and just get us into it. So reminder, any questions you guys have at any point, pop them into Office Hours channel on Slack or into the YouTube chat here. If you are watching this as a recording and you want a question to be answered on Office Hours, just email us support@sabersim.com ask your question. Let us know that you'd like to see it answered on office hours. We'll get to it on the show. I know there are a lot of you guys watching the recordings because I'm starting to hear from you guys in the support inbox. So let us know that way as well. If you don't have access to Slack, that's another question that has come up in the support inbox. Shoot us an email. As long as you are a subscriber, we can get you into Slack if you watch the recording, and we can go from there. So we've got a handful of people now watching here. Looks like 6 of us. Welcome, everybody. I am going to go ahead and get us started. I know there has been a handful of discussion over the long weekend here. Some ongoing conversation about the sports betting and how to leverage some of the information we're getting from Vegas here. So I am planning on diving back into that closer to the end of our episode today. But we did get some good questions here about 25 minutes ago from Briz in the Slack channel. And first of all, he said, this may be too far on the basic side. I'll stop you right there. I'm certain it isn't. There are no questions that are too basic for office hours. Whatever your questions are, please always ask. If there's something that we feel like we have well documented elsewhere in our FAQs or something like that, I will point you in that direction first. But a question that you feel like is basic or don't want to ask, I'm sure there are a ton of other people that have that question. And in this particular case, these are not basic questions. It looks like there's a few questions here. The general theme is, should I use player exposures or projections to make changes after my build? So looks like we have 3 different questions here. I will go ahead and just pop these in so everyone can follow along. Let's see. All right, so question 1 here was, if you can effectively adjust player projections or increase or cap exposures in step 3, when should you be doing each? So yeah, let's talk about this a little bit because this is pretty interesting concept here. Boom. All right. So we have SaberSim up. I got the general feeling, Briz, that when you sent this message, you were talking about NBA. I don't know what gave me that impression. I think maybe stars and value plays just resonated a little bit more NBA for me. So I'm going to talk using the NBA builder, but if this is more about baseball, we can do that too. It won't make much of a difference, but let's just run a test build here. I'm going to right away just remove or just tweak the projections slightly here so I don't get the message, and we'll build 20 and talk about this a little bit. So all right, we let our build complete. So the question here really, they're all about, we can edit our projections here and change our result, or edit our min exposures or max exposures and adjust our player pool that way. The primary answer here is that there's not really a right or wrong way to do this. I believe the second question here, so I'm going to kind of handle these all around the same time here. The second question is, should you be avoiding adjusting the player projection in step 3 and only adjusting player projections if planning to go back and run a new build? Okay, I think I get what this question is asking. If you are running a test build, for example, and you plan on, like we always talk about, just running this, seeing what we get out of it, and then we're ultimately going to run back and tweak settings and change things for what is going to be our final build, then the answer is yes. You should avoid editing any projections in this build for now that you don't want to lose, because you are going to lose them. These are only for the build. If I go and change Jokic to 54 and get a different amount of Jokic here, that's not going to stay with us if we go back and do another build. So in that regard, yes, you would want to always just, if you make projection changes within the build, just be aware you're going to lose them if you go back to step 1. I'm gonna jump down to question 3 now here, because I think these are a little bit more easy questions to answer right at the start. So the question 3 says, it seems as if there may be a fine line between too much adjusting or capping of exposures in step 3 and just needing to start over and rebuild. How do you know when you're making too many changes and should just start over? That is also a good question. If you make a lot of changes, especially dramatic changes, where you're doing something that the builder really doesn't expect, so like zeroing out players that it really wants to use a lot of, you are eventually going to see a message that says you need to build more lineups. And it will be a while, but if you have a lot of custom exposures, or especially if you start forcing strange stacks, eventually, so we're getting close, there it is. So we need to expand the lineup pool in order to match your requested exposures, continue building. You can just click yes here. And what it's going to do is it's going to build more. But it is going to build more with the same set of rules that you originally gave it. So you can see it's going to say, okay, we still need to build more. Do you want to continue building? And you can continue going down this path. And first off, before I go much further, we know this isn't the easiest thing to deal with here once you start adding a lot of these exposures in. So we have some improvements that we've been working on behind the scenes here and more to come to make this a little bit more user-friendly. But for the meantime, I would say if you see this message once or twice or a few times, this is a very good flag that you should probably go back and adjust something in step 1 or 2 to resolve this. And it depends on really what you're trying to do here in step 3 that would indicate what you maybe should go back to step 1. But let's say, for example, right, like we crossed off some of these most highest owned plays, and we're getting a ton of LeBron, right? And who else are we getting a lot of? We're getting a ton of LeBron, and we don't want to play LeBron for whatever reason, and we're getting a lot of Paul, and we don't want Paul. In this case, it would be a good idea to go back and just X these guys out, and remove them from the pool. Or if you didn't want to do that and that was too extreme, but you were just getting way too much of them, a good approach would be to just drop their projection by a fair bit. So at MLB, for example, that you may see that message if you are being very restrictive with your stack types. So let's look at MLB real quick. So let's say in MLB, you built 150 lineups or something like that, or whatever. And you knew you only wanted 5 3 stacks or something like that, and you went in and restricted all your stack types. Here, let's just go ahead and do this. We have plenty of time. I'm not going to do 150 for the purpose of just showing this off. We'll use 20. Let's let this one build for a second now here, but I'm sure you guys already kind of get where I am going with this. These breaks while I'm building lineups are good anyway, because I run out of breath here sitting and rambling and talking the whole time. So anyway, okay. So you've got this different set of build types, right? These are going to generally look pretty good, but let's say you decided you only wanted 5 3 stacks to begin with or something like that. So we would just start crossing these off, right? And it's going to do this just fine. No issues. Typically, that's going to be the case. But then if you also start going in here and you're playing with your batters, right? And you're bringing some of these batter exposures down and you're doing this, eventually you're going to do enough here where you're going to start to see that message. So this is something we commonly do, is bring these down. In this particular case, a good thing to do would be to go back and set a stacking rule, a manual stacking rule, and basically just say, hey, I only want 5 stacks. So you would do that here in the stacking tab, at least 5 players from the same team. And then eventually, whenever you see that inevitable, now when you build, when you see that message that says you need to build more lineups, if that message does come back up, this baseline rule's already there. So it's going to just build, it's only going to build lineups that have 5 stacks anyway, right? So that's the way, that's a good way to think about it, is make sure that you are giving the builder rules and projections that make sense for what you are trying to do if you are going to put a lot of exposures down here in the second part of your lineup building process. Hopefully that makes sense. But let's see. And I'm going to keep us going here to really question 1. I think the one that is still up on the screen, because I think this is the one that is the most nuanced, right? About if you can effectively adjust player projections or increase cap exposures, when should you be doing each? So we covered, right? If you really want to change projections, but you're going to come back and run another build, do it on the home page. Don't do it on this page. And two, if you are adding a lot of exposures and things like that, and you're seeing a message to build more lineups, probably another sign to go back to the homepage. But let's say this is your final build, and the question is, should I edit my exposures here? Should I adjust my projections here? The answer really is, it depends on kind of what you are most comfortable with. I know a lot of players, especially I feel like more on the NBA side, just kind of have a good grasp, like an intuitive touch with projections of like, you can think about it as players relative to each other, or just in getting the exposures you want. What do you do to projections? So if you're like that kind of player, like if we do show all and you're looking at the top plays, right? And like this, and it resonates with you, a way of getting certain exposure to players by editing projections, that's fine, right? Like if you want less Jokic, it's totally fine to come in here and say, I'm going to do it this way. And bring his projection down like that and get less Jokic. It is also totally fine to just cap his exposure at, like, say you want him at the field, right? That's also totally fine. I would say the exposure is going to be a little bit more of a specific, like, surgical change, right? It's very easy to say, I want to match the projected field on Jokic and just put him at 35 and just be done with it, regardless of what his projection is. If you're not thinking about your lineups in that way, and you're more kind of thinking about, I don't know, the overall like feeling of the projections, you can approach it that way. If it's probably coming across that I'm not very projection oriented here, because I'm not. I almost always handle my exposures in step 3 by actually directly messing with the mins and maxes. I like to think about projections as something that is done more on the inputs and really on the teams, right? Like, I'm not the kind of person to just say, you know what, I'm a little more bearish on Jokic and I'm going to take him down, but I might be bearish on the Nuggets and maybe I'm bringing them down. That's just kind of my approach here. This is something that I'm way more likely to do. And then you get the correlative effects of this. You see some small bumps to some Trailblazers players, things like that. So that's typically going to be more of my approach. But I know like some very savvy players that can kind of look again, or look at the highest projected players, or look at the value options and kind of judge their priors, right? Thinking about kind of this Bayesian thinking of what research they've done on the slate, and make adjustments directly to the projections. So Briz, I don't know if you're watching now. Hopefully that is helpful. I will summarize here real quickly and say, answer to question 1 here in your Slack channel is, it really depends. Answer to question 2 is, yes, you should avoid adjusting projections in step 3 if you're planning on running another build. And question 3, is there a line where you shouldn't cross in terms of editing exposures on step 3? I would say once you are repeatedly seeing that message that you need to build more lineups, it is a sign that you need to go back to step 1 or 2 and change some things to give the builder a little bit more to work with, or to know what kind of lineups you're trying to get out. So, all right, cool. Let's see. I see maybe a question in progress here from Iteru in Slack. I am going to go ahead, Iteru, and give you a moment to get your thoughts together here and take us back to some of these questions here that took place over the weekend about sports betting, or not so much sports betting, but how to use. Oh, actually, I got distracted here and I saw a terrorist message. So I'm going to just go ahead and take a look here at this. We have, when I downloaded the player projection CSV, I have some fields I would like some clarification on. The column K for strikeouts, is that the average number of a certain hitter being struck out? I ask because what does this value mean for pitchers? Since pitchers can be hitters as well, is that column referring to them being struck out or striking hitters out? It's a good question. Let's put that up on the screen here. Okay, let me pull this up here. So what Eteru is referring to here is this download button that will let you download your projections. It does, we learned last week actually, and I learned this for the first time, it does filter by what you are currently filtering on the page, which actually is definitely in that feature, not a bug kind of area. Just something to note, but it is actually very useful. For example, like if you only want pictures exported, you can do so just by clicking picture and then clicking download, or same thing if you only want a certain team, you can search that team. Whatever you want to do. So the question here, and I think I will have to share my Excel. Let me pull this up here. Okay, I think I do. Let me share my Excel screen. Okay, so this is what it looks like when I'm going to, hang on, I got you guys on a big monitor here, and I think it's a little hard to see. That should be a little easier to see. Okay, so this is what it looks like when you export your projections, if you haven't done this before. We pretty much give you everything here that is in our detailed projections, so a lot of data to work with. And the question here is Ks, right? And for pitchers and for hitters. I think you pretty much nailed it, Eteru. They actually do mean two different things. So I'm assuming, are we still looking at? Yeah, I think you pretty much just nailed that, right? For pitchers, this is the average, the mean number of strikeouts that they get as a pitcher in every simulation we have. And for hitters, this is the mean here. So let me actually make this a little bit easier to see. I'll just clear everything that isn't what we're looking at here right now. Or actually, let's do this. Okay, so now we just have player name. Probably could have kept position there, but this is fine, right? So you can see there's some pitching data here. So yeah, for strikeouts, it looks like we are using it differently, where for pitchers, it's going to be the total number of strikeouts the mean number of strikeouts that they get in all of our simulations. And then for hitters, it's going to be the mean number of times they strike out in all of our simulations. So you can see like guys like Joey Gallo, high strikeout rates, Teoscar Hernandez, another strikeout guy. So they are a little bit higher. Guys that play a little bit safer at the plate, strike out less, are projected lower. Yeah, so that should be correct. So hopefully that helps. I realized we probably didn't even need to download it. I think that data is also just in our detailed projections. Let me go ahead and share SaberSim again. Yeah, so that is actually, oh, it's not. So it doesn't display by default when you open up detailed projections. So, oh yeah, strikeouts. It's just SO instead of K here. So same thing here, pretty much. So good question. What happens when the pitcher is also hitting? So we will, like for guys like Ohtani or something like that, right? We're going to follow what the sites are doing that night. So to this point, at least, we are going to treat the player. This is a really good question. We're going to treat the player in terms of the stats that we're providing for the player's position that they are going to be scored that night, right? So some nights Ohtani's pitching and he's scored as a pitcher, and DraftKings will say, we're not treating him as a hitter. You're not getting hitting points. In that particular case, you should see strikeouts listed as if he was a pitcher, and he will be projected. All of his things will be as if he was a pitcher. In our simulations, we are still recognizing that Ohtani's going to come up and hit. And we'll have like internal information in the sims about what he's likely to do as a hitter as it relates to the rest of his team, and as it relates to the other pitcher and things like that. But the stats that are visible for you here that you can use will be all based when he's a pitcher, because that's the way he scored on the sites, right? Same thing, vice versa. Even if he's pitching, but if he's hitting and he's treated as a hitter by the site, the stats you are seeing should be for his hitting statistics for that night. And it should consistently match up with the way that the sites are handling that player. If and when the sites decide to start doing something unique with Ohtani or other two-way players, if any come up, we will probably cross that bridge when we get to it. It will probably depend a lot on how they are particularly deciding to handle that. But yeah, so we will treat the player as the position they are officially scored that night, but our sims can definitely understand two-way players, and Ohtani within the simulated data for a team like the Angels, if he is both pitching and hitting that night, we will treat him as such. So hopefully that makes sense. Really interesting question though. Thank you for asking that. But all right, cool. So let's see. We are approaching the halfway point of our show today. I haven't seen any other questions come in yet. So if you have questions you've been waiting to ask, great time to pop those in now. I do want to spend a little bit more time talking about looking at line movements and things like that, since there were some questions about that here over the weekend, especially how to use these things for DFS. So I know there were a few follow-up questions from Jay and Shiver Me Ginger, a few other questions in Slack, particularly about the sports betting and prop betting side. I see Max already got back to you guys on a couple of those. I'm going to be completely honest. I'm not a great sports bettor. It's something I dabble in. I don't want to sit here and give strategy recommendations on the sports betting side as much. So I think continue to ask those questions in the channel. I think it would be great. Maybe we could do a part 2 strategy session, especially now that we've talked about it a little bit, answer some more questions. I'm happy to talk a little bit in terms of how SaberSim works or any technical questions like that on the sports betting side, but I don't really want to give deep dive. I know there's a question here about Jay asked, leveraging the prop betting tool with what you like to look for, what triggers a warning for further research, where you found SaberSim to have nice advantages. Again, I don't want to, being a bit of a novice sports bettor here, give out advice on that side. So keep asking, Max. I think it might be a good idea to maybe have a little part 2 there and review some of this stuff. But anyway, I do want to talk a little bit about there was a question here about line movements. Is there a better way to look and see line movements? What are others doing for line movements? And I want to spend a little bit more time talking about it on the DFS side and things that I'm looking for and the way I edit my projections. I know that there was also a question from Jonathan Liu last Friday night and said, when should you be adjusting projections, particularly for the NBA? So I think this could be a useful channel, not a useful channel, a useful conversation. But if it isn't, this isn't interesting to anybody, just let me know and pop a question in chat and we will pivot. But I want to come back a little bit to this Fantasy Labs. Let's see. Fantasy Labs page here where they've got the totals and talk a little bit more about the things that we can do and what we are looking for on this page. So let me pull this back up here. It is always good to make sure that you have the most recent projections because this is things have slightly changed since I was last looking at this here. But again, so things that we are primarily looking for when treating Vegas as a signal for us to maybe edit projections. I think there are really 3 of them, I guess. I am looking for, let me think about this. I'm looking for big changes in Vegas's take over the course of the day. I am looking for significant discrepancies between the live Vegas odds and the live SaberSim odds. And I am also looking for, to me, kind of 2 signals are always over 5 runs or less than 4 runs. That can change a little bit as the season goes on and the temperatures rate come up in the summer and the totals are a little bit higher, but over 5 runs to me is kind of something I'm looking at as like a potential chalky hitting team, and lower than 4 runs is something that I'm thinking about as a potentially chalky pitcher on the other side. So those are kind of my signals, right? And I will start looking here at these things in conjunction. And a lot of times on a big game slate like this, I will go game by game. And I'm looking basically to see, what does the live look like compared to SaberSim? Is it a half run or more different? And then what do the trends look like, right? So I'm going to just start walking through some of these because, again, I say we want to use the current day slate for examples. Let's do it here. So first game on the slate, right? Rays and Yankees. And this has actually changed since right before I was coming on here. But we are higher on both of these teams, right? And we have seen here neither of these trends have moved much since open. The one other thing you can look at is these trends. And actually, right before I came on, these were both a little higher. It was actually 4-2 and 3-9. So I was planning on talking a little bit different about this game. But that's why it's always important to look as close as you can to luck, right? We're still getting lineups now. We're still getting pitchers confirmed. So this information is going to change. But it's interesting to look at this, right? So we are slightly higher on this game. It hasn't been a lot of line movement, right? So I will just kind of start taking notes and thinking about where we stand. I'm just going to keep going through these and then we'll come back and talk. So Twins Orioles, right? We are pretty much right on with the Orioles, and we are about a half run lower on the Twins. And again, no real movement. Sometimes I'll take notes on these too, just so especially on a big slate, just so I can kind of stay like I can remember everything. Let's keep going. We'll get to some here in a second that I think are going to start to get pretty interesting. So Miami and Toronto, this game we are almost right on 3-9, 4-8, 3-9, 4-7. Not a lot of movement. Here's one of the first interesting games of the slate, I think, where there's kind of a significant difference between SaberSim and Vegas. And there's a handful of these games on a big slate like this that I think are kind of the pivot games that really make up your edge that you have on the slate, right? So Phillies and Reds, it is Nola and Sonny Gray on the mound here, two kind of highly projected pitchers. And we have this game at 4-5 Phillies, 4-2 Reds, and Vegas has it at 3-7 and 3-9, right? So definitely start to see a little bit of a discrepancy there. And one thing I will start to look at, and we talked about last week, is looking at the overall trends of where the line has moved to, right? So this has slightly moved up for the Phillies. It has moved up almost a half run for the Reds. I think that is somewhat encouraging here, that is moving towards SaberSim. But what you can also look at is actually this line movement graph here, and you can get an idea of kind of where there is resistance in the betting markets to it moving higher, right? So the Reds have actually been now at 3-9. This is their highest total of the day. You can see it in the chart here, and could conceivably still get a little bit higher. That's the team we're also the closest on, right? The Phillies, on the other hand, has only moved up a tenth of a run. It found some resistance at 3.8 runs, and it seems like this is a little bit more kind of closer to where it's going to be. Again, this is analysis that like I probably would not go this deep into until the lineup cards are all out, because a lot can change. But I just want to talk through in detail a little bit more about what I might be looking for here. So this is one, right, where SaberSim is going to be more bearish on some of these stud pitchers than the field. So something to note, right? Maybe you're taking notes, however you want to go about doing it. And we'll keep moving. The next game here, Washington-Atlanta, is another game that I think is going to be kind of one of those pivot games. This is probably the game that we are most dramatically different from at the moment, and I think we'll probably continue to be higher on this game. We have 5-0 runs for the Nationals and 4-8 runs for the Braves, right? So we are full run over, just a little bit over for the Braves now. And if we look, We've seen the Nationals went up to 4.2. They came back down to 4 on that line. So there is some resistance at like 4.25. The Braves have gone up to 4.9, and there was some resistance there. They came back down to 4.6. The Braves were actually very close on. The line has moved throughout the day towards us, so I feel pretty good. But the Nationals is a very interesting one, right? This line has moved towards us throughout the day, but it is seeing resistance at like 4.2, and we have it at 5.0. So this is a team that we are very bullish on their hitting. Max Fried is on the mound for the Braves. I think we are probably, you can kind of correlate this here. We are very relatively low on him. He's pretty cheap, and we don't have him at a very good value. This is an important game of the slate. And then I'm going to just keep us moving. I don't think I'm going to actually sit here and analyze all 14 games because we're going to run out of time doing this live, but I'm going to talk about one other big pivot game that kind of here is at the moment, and that's Boston and Houston, where we are at 4.5 for Boston and 4.8 for Houston. And we are pretty close to Houston here. And the Red Sox have basically cratered as the day has gone on. They are now projected for under 4 runs. You can see it's still kind of in a free fall. It hasn't really even seen kind of a floor yet. And that's another thing that is interesting and to take a look at here, right? So this line is quickly moving away from us. We are coming down on this as well. We had 5-1 earlier this morning, so this is coming down too as more information about the game is coming out. I think the big thing that moved the line for us earlier, or the SaberSim line, was just closing the roof. We had an open roof, I think, projected in our simulations. It looks like that roof is probably going to be closed, so we closed it. The totals came down, but we're still pretty high on this game, right? So let's see. We've talked about a couple games in detail here. So let's go ahead. We talked about Philly and Cincinnati, right? This is a game that has good pitching on the mound that we are a little bit higher on. We talked about Washington in particular, we are much higher on. And we talked about Boston and Houston, so we are also higher on with more value pitching on the mound. And again, maybe you're going through and analyzing all the teams on the slate when you're actually doing your own research here, but let's now run our test build and just see what we are getting out and get an idea of how this is kind of influencing the build, right? And if you don't have time to, right, like we've been talking here for about 15, 20 minutes about this, probably closer to 15 on this topic, right? This isn't something that you have to do in detail for every 14-game slate. There are little cues. You can kind of fit this to what your process is and how much time you have, right? Like maybe you don't have time to analyze the difference between SaberSim and the Vegas odds on every single game, but you can look at the teams where the Vegas odds have shifted dramatically throughout the day, and maybe you want to spend a little special time getting an idea of how is SaberSim looking at the Reds, the Red Sox, the Tigers, the Dodgers. That's it. Every team that's moved almost 0.4 runs over the course of the day, and doing this kind of analysis for that team. But I thought this would be building a little faster in the background here. All right, cool. Keep talking on this subject for a little bit longer. Big Sub, I see you had a question. We will get to that before the end of the show here. Yeah, let me keep us going here, and then we'll come back around to some of these last questions. So let's look at this now, right? So we can now start to kind of think, like, what's coming out of this? Maybe we go back and look at a couple teams and just overall, how are we feeling? So one thing to me that would be a potential flag, and it's a flag partially because when I ran this an hour ago to prepare for the show, we were getting a ton of Washington, right? Just an insane amount of Washington, 35% now, right? For the single team that we are projected over a run greater than Vegas, to me, isn't a huge concern, right? What would possibly be concerning about this to me is if this was 100 like it was earlier. Maybe that would be an indication that I want to bring them down a little bit because we're so much higher than Vegas, and the line has moved just a little bit, that maybe I don't want to be in that particular spot with that team. Let's look at some teams that we are different from, right? So Red Sox, right? Red Sox is gone. They've almost dropped a full implied run. I would be curious if we have any Boston bats. We don't. So that's another situation where like I'm feeling somewhat okay about that. Right? Like we're really high on Boston compared to the Vegas, but I'm not getting a lot of Boston bats. I'm okay with that. And then we can kind of keep looking here and seeing. So another thing that strikes me here, getting quite a few lineups with Sonny Gray and Nola. So we're over the field right now on both of these pitchers. And what is interesting about that here, right? So let's look at these pitching games again. There's really two kind of interesting pitching games here going on where we have on the Rays Yankees, we are over on this game, right? We have a higher total for both the Rays and Yankees. We're somewhat pessimistic about Glass now. And the same deal with Sonny Gray and Aaron Nola. But what we're seeing in the Phillies-Reds game is that the line has come up a little bit from where it opened, whereas we're seeing some resistance to that line movement on the Rays-Yankees game. So what that indicates to me is that I probably am a little bit more willing to trust our Glass now exposures. And I don't know if I want to be over the field on pitchers that we're already bearish on and Vegas has slowly come up on over the day. So one way to do that would be to come here and adjust some of these down, and maybe you're picking a more even with the field approach on some of those pitchers. Let's go back here to step one and talk a little bit more about projections and what you can do with some of these team projections, right? So on a big slate, we, in general, are going to need, think about the right way to say this. We're less interested in searching for really harsh edges, and we need to push our edges a little bit less on a large slate like this because a lot of people are just going to make mistakes, right? It's going to be harder to just be right, and being accurate, right? Being accurate with your projections is just going to take you further because there's going to be a lot of people that aren't. There's going to be a lot of people without accurate projections. Ownership is going to be so spread out that we don't need to play as much of a ownership leverage game. And the build settings typically will reflect that. So we will see on a contest for a slate like tonight, right? Ownership fade comes down all the way to moderate. Baseball is a variant game. We always have some ownership fade, but it's much lower than it would be on a smaller slate. So we account for that with some of the build settings, but we can also account for that in a little bit of the way we think about the slate, right? So let's go back and look at Washington. We were getting like 35% Washington stacks. Maybe we're just okay with that, but we're a full run over Vegas, and we are seeing that there is resistance from Vegas at just 4.2 or something like that. Actually, let's take an example of a team where the line, because this is a little bit of a gray area. Let's use an example of a team where they have gone like very clearly opposite direction of SaberSim. So would be a good example of that. I actually think today we're pretty aligned. No, let's stay with what we were looking at, right? So we like Washington, right? We're seeing that there's resistance at 4.2. It has climbed it from where it started at 3.7. The line has moved closer to where we are at 5.0, but it doesn't look like maybe it's going to move a lot further unless we get a surprise news with the lineup, right? So this is a situation where you can still have a lot of your edge, and maybe you're meeting the line in the middle here. And we're still a half run over on the Nationals overall, right? Same thing with the Red Sox. This is a team that the public or the sharp money or big money is just very pessimistic on tonight comparatively from where we are. And we can still be over the field, right? We can still take a somewhat contrarian approach to Boston. We aren't getting any Boston bats with 20 lineups, but maybe we would be with 150. And we can still take that approach, but get a little bit closer to Vegas here and still kind of generally have that approach where we're almost hedged a little bit. We're still allowing ourselves to be contrarian, overweight on that team, but we're not committing 35% of our lineups necessarily to a team like the Nationals or something like that. Let's look. I want to see. I want to use another example. So let's go back. Let's go back to like the Phillies and Reds here, right? A team that we have projected for some of the top end pitchers on the slate, probably some higher owned pitchers on the slate, and maybe see what we want to do with that game, right? So this is another one where the line has come up a little bit throughout the day. It's gotten closer to us, but it's not all the way there. Maybe we leave the Reds alone, right? It's climbed 0.4 runs. We are only 0.3 runs higher than their total now. But the Phillies, we're seeing a lot of resistance right around this 3-8 line. So maybe we bring this down here a little bit too and bump that down. So this is kind of a good way that you can use some of these trends. You know, I right before this show, we had some trends that were a little bit, I'm bumping a lot of these totals down. Some of these lines have moved, and SaberSim has rerun Sims, obviously. So some of these things have changed. There actually aren't really any teams now. I was looking here where the line is like dramatically running away from us anymore, which makes sense. We've resimmed, gotten a little bit tighter. So when I say the line is running away from us, what I'm basically saying is that let's say, so the Twins opened at 5-1, right? And we have them at 4-7. If this was climbing and getting further away from us and had already opened higher than us and it proceeded to get higher, that's kind of what I'm referring to. And that's a fairly strong signal that maybe you should take a closer look at that team. I did see it on NBA though. So let me check NBA and see if it's still the case. So yeah, I think it is. So let's look at NBA here. Okay, so here's an example, and this is a much smaller effect. But for the Nets tonight, right, we have them at like 120.5 points. Vegas opened at 121.75, and they have proceeded to get a little bit higher on the Nets as the day has gone on. So this is one where, to a lesser extent, the line is moving away from us. To me, this would be a somewhat stronger signal, even though we're talking about like maybe a point or two to maybe bump up a projection there. That's kind of what I'm talking about in terms of the trends that you can be looking for. So baseball, again, it is looking like even on the teams that we are higher or lower than, they have moved our direction throughout the day. So, oops. The last thing I will talk about here too is we definitely... Okay, so now Boston's come up a little bit. This is interesting. I end up watching these throughout most of the day, seeing where these lines move. So the one other thing I'll talk about here is often get some questions about ownership and like ownership seeming wrong on guys, and that is totally fine. You can do a lot in terms of adding value to your process by looking at just live lines close to lock and making some adjustments there. Something I will do sometimes is, especially on baseball, right, is I will just take notes and jot down the teams with the lowest implied totals and basically take the team playing against the lowest implied total teams across the entire slate and then just correlate that to the ownership rankings here on the side. And just looking at pitchers, for example. And you can very quickly get an idea of where you can maybe make some small tweaks. So I actually did this earlier this morning. Ownership has since reran, and we've gotten some different numbers here. But you can do this pretty quickly, right? So like Glasnow, Ray, Sonny Gray, Nola, Boyd. That's your top 5 in terms of projected ownership of pitchers. And we can just check those teams against them. Right? So Glasnow's facing the Yankees. It's a correlating run total. Their run total is pretty low. I think they're probably likely going to be I think he's likely going to be a highly owned pitcher. Same thing with Ray against the Marlins, who have a low total. We already talked about this game, low total. Those all make sense. The one that really sticks out is Boyd to me, where is the Tigers. He's going against the Brewers, 4.3 run total. Obviously, salary has something to go into this, right? Like Boyd's salary is just super low. But personally, something I've noticed is that a lot of people chase these lines. I think people are going to find other values instead of Boyd, and maybe you just drop him down like half. And you can do this the other way too, right? So pitchers that I think are likely to be highly owned that I'm not seeing on this list so far are Chris Bassett, who's up against the Mariners, and probably both sides of this game, Heaney and Alex Wood. Right? Those are some pitchers that I think should probably be a little bit higher. And I don't see them. I see Bassett here approaching, but like my particular perspective on the way I think this ownership is going to fall. Oh, Heaney is up here, top 5. But I think Alex Wood is likely to be a play that people go to a little bit more than some of these other guys. And maybe I'm just tweaking their ownership up a bit, right? You can get a lot from these lines, right? Like it's very useful in assessing chalk. Same thing with hitting. Right off the bat, 5 run total teams. You have the Twins. You have the Astros now. That moved up. You have the Dodgers. And then you've got Coors. I would say this secondary chalk is probably going to be some of these 4, 8, 4, 9. So you've got like Rockies, Rangers, Royals, to a lesser extent, the Blue Jays, right? You can start looking at batters and seeing, these ownerships. And this should like correlate to you. And if it doesn't, it's a good place that you can add a little bit of value, right? Like I see Washington is a highly projected owned team at the moment, which is probably a little bit inflated because we have them at such a high projected team total. So one thing you can do here, very quick for just like quick edits. Sometimes I will just cut these in half and just kind of work from there, at least as a starting point, and adjust this team and go down and cut some of these totals. So same thing here, right? We're under on the Twins. They're not really popping in terms of ownership. So now we have the Twins lead off. I think the Twins, personally, I mean, my take with what I'm seeing right now, I think that the Twins and the and Coors are going to be like the mega chalk tonight. So another way you can just go ahead and start adding in some additional ownership onto these guys. And I'm just doubling these two. And I know this isn't necessarily mathematically always going to work out because there are ownership calculations and things that take place to make sure, like, for example, on DraftKings, your total pitcher ownership should always be 200%. Because every lineup has 2 pitchers in it. We won't always have that exactly, but this is just another way you can kind of edit some of these numbers around, right? Continue to add value by looking at lines and looking at Vegas as signals in your process. So I probably could have continued to go on, talk about this longer. I hope that was useful, kind of clearer there. We get a lot of questions about like what should I edit? Like when should I edit these teams and ownership and player projections? And those are all really good questions. A lot of the value you can add takes place here by looking at some of those signals. So I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of a way to kind of think about doing that. Before we start to wrap up a little bit here, let me make sure. No other questions in YouTube. Big Sub did ask, how is value determined, meaning what is considered a good value? Value is the projected points divided by the projected points times 1,000 divided by the salary of the player, right? So it's basically like a how much bang do you get for your buck type calculation. And in terms of what is considered good value, you're going to hear a lot of different answers to that question based on who you ask. There are rules of thumb about how to think about value. I'm going to reset all my projections here real quick. Do these real quick just so we can get back to basic SaberSim here. Actually, it's not that important for the purpose of going over this. There are some rules of thumb that you can use. I like to look at, for pitching, this is a huge slate tonight, but I typically like 2x value for my pitchers as just like a baseline of like where the lines are drawn. You see that lets a lot of pitchers into your pool for a slate like this tonight, but that's kind of a rule of thumb I'll look at. Batters, honestly, like unless you're playing cash games, I don't even really care about value because you're typically going to see a bunch of these min price guys that bat fairly high in the order are going to be like super high value plays, and it just doesn't mean that much. Like we can look at Almonte's range of outcomes, right? His most likely outcome is 0. The win condition that you roster this guy and you end up winning something with him is that when it's the Brave stack goes off. That's why we stack anyway. And I guess one thing that you will probably see with players like this is MLB DFS players that don't know how to build very good lineups are going to get a lot of these kinds of guys because traditional optimizers that optimize for median projection are going to give you a lot of these guys. Even if you set manual stacking rules, what you're going to see, like somebody that goes on and uses some random optimizer and says, give me only 5 stacks, build me 150 lineups and go. They're going to get a lot of lineups that have the highest mean projected stack, which like if you looked, if they were using our projections, a team that pops, I guess, is kind of like the Twins that has some guys here. And then they're going to get 3 one-offs of like 3 very good point per dollar value hitters and then some point per dollar pitchers. And that's not really a good way to build MLB DFS lineups, right? Because we're building for upside. And that's one of the things that SaberSim can do really well for you. On the NBA side, I would say value is definitely a lot more of a useful signal. And you will typically hear 5x thrown around, especially on big NBA slates. On DraftKings, you hear 5x. I think on FanDuel, people say a little bit more like 6x in terms of like good value. The problem with those heuristics, again, is that it's a rule of thumb that doesn't fit every situation. And in particular for like really almost any sport, but especially in basketball, I would say you need to be... Value goes further for you the higher salary the player is, right? And a lot of that comes into the opportunity cost of a player. So let's look at our highest owned or our highest value projected player on the slate right now, which is Peyton Pritchard. And he's the only player with a 6x value on DraftKings. Actually, I think he's probably even a little bit higher because I have this edit here. Oh, it didn't really move anything, right? And he looks like a pretty good play. And you're probably going to get a ton of Peyton Pritchard if you run lineups tonight. In my lineups, I'm sure I'll have some of him. But the thing to be aware of here is, let's say he actually just goes out and scores 23 points, right? And he has a 7x value. Wow, like 7x. That's so good, right? You're looking for 5x. You got 7x. That's so good. On a big slate, these guys like this can actually end up hurting the potential upside of your lineup if you built just totally looking at value, because you have a player, regardless of salary, you have a slot on your lineup that was filled by somebody that only scored 23 points. And it just means that your total lineup potential overall, unless you get enormous performances from some of your other players, right, is relatively capped. And you can even kind of see it by looking at some of these ranges of outcomes, like, or looking at ceiling, right? So let's look at, let's say we treat, oh, hang on. Okay. Let's say we're going to treat ceiling as 85th percentile or something like that, right? Like they're going to hit this. They're 15% of the time ceiling, right? For Jokic, that's 73. It's 7x value. For Pritchard, it's 8.25x value. And you're going to see the higher you go, the higher you take this percentile. So let's take it to 95th. The more extreme this effect is going to be. The effect being the players that have the lowest salaries are going to continue to skyrocket in terms of their value at that percentile. In other words, you're probably never going to see. So now we're at 95th percentile, right? Jokic went to 79 points. He's now at 7.5 value. And Pritchard went from 8.25 value to almost 10x value, right? The high end, the very highest ceiling percentage of your studs on your teams are never as high on a point per dollar basis as your super low on value plays, which is why you need to be careful of players that are very low salary with very good median projection points, right? You essentially need a 95th percentile outcome for some of these min price guys to start becoming useful in NBA and start becoming not an opportunity cost hole for your team. Whereas for studs and players that are just going to play a ton of minutes, like if you got a 75th percentile outcome from Jokic, you're probably pretty happy with 68 points. So that is something to be aware of in terms of value. So I guess in another way, right, that SaberSim ends up becoming super useful is we actually have all these simulations and we can look at this kinds of thing and see when we're using like higher smart diversities and things like that, like what is the actual upside of a guy like Pritchard or Cam Johnson or some of these value plays, right? What can they actually do, right? If you were totally using a median projection model, your optimizer would essentially value someone like Cameron Johnson and someone like Damian Lillard at approximately the same overall value of what they bring to the lineup. And obviously that's not the way it actually works when you're building GPP lineups. So yeah, a little rambly there, Big Sub. I would say in summary, value determined, points times 1,000 divided by price. There are a lot of heuristics in terms of the ways you can determine good value. Again, I think 5x for DK NBA, 6x for FanDuel NBA. Pitchers have their own thing in baseball. I play a lot of DraftKings, so I think that 2x mark, again, decent as like looking at heuristics. There's a ton in NFL too, but be very careful about that. And if you are going to actually start looking at target scores, like if you're going to think about target values, I would instead look at target scores, and I would recommend experiment with a multiplier and then a flat score on top of that. So in other words, don't go out looking to roster a bunch of DK players that have a 5x value, right? Don't think about it that way. Instead, say I'm going to go out or say even 6x value, right? A lot of times you'll hear 6x for GPP, which is coming basically from, I know I'm going long here, so that's fine. But the 6x for GPP thing basically comes from someone taking the total salary, which is 50K, and multiplying it by 6 and getting 300 points, or 7x. Maybe you say you need 350, right? That's where that calculation comes from. Instead of doing that, try to come up with a linear component of that. So instead say something like, I want 5x plus 10 for my players, right? And that will allow some of these players, that will require more from these super cheap players that come out with really good point per dollar values. And it will have less of an impact on your studs, right? Like you're very rarely going to see a stud projected at 6x value, even though a lot of these guys are really good plays. So if you were doing something like that, instead of saying that you're just looking for 19.5 points, 6x value for Pritchard, you want 5x plus 10. That would be 3.2. plus, or 3.2 times 5 plus 10. That's 26 points, right? In terms of a score you're looking at for Pritchard. If you were doing 5x plus 10 for someone like Jokic, you would have 10.4 plus, or 10.4 times 5 plus 10. That's 62. So you can see Jokic is pretty close to his target score, if that's the equation you used, already at his average percentile. But Pritchard needs to have probably something like a 75th type performance. Not even 75th. Pritchard needs an 85th percentile performance to hit his 26 points that represents his 5x plus 10 value target score. And it's actually 8.25x. So not so good of a GPP play when you start to look at it through that lens. So I'm rambling here. We are 5 minutes over. Had fun talking about some of this stuff today. Hopefully this is still useful for you guys. I appreciate everyone that comes in here and watches me talk about this stuff every day. Continue to ask any questions you guys have. Email us, support@sabersim.com. We will be right back again tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern, talking about whatever you guys want. I will have this video up, recorded, time-stamped this afternoon, and posted for everyone that's watching it later in the evenings or whenever you're watching this. And I will see you guys again tomorrow. Thanks for tuning in.